When we think of mythical little people, probably the first thing that comes to mind are the stories of leprechauns. However, a myriad of stories can be found in Cherokee lore. One of my favorite Cherokee tales mentions a tribe of little people who found themselves constantly harassed by geese. These people were known as the Sundewee, and James Mooney told their story in his book, Myths of the Cherokee. Said Mooney, once some young men of the Cherokee set out to see what was in the world, and traveled south until they came to a tribe of little people called the Sundewee, with very queer-shaped bodies, hardly tall enough to reach up to a man's knee, who had no houses but lived in nests scooped in the sand and covered over with dry grass. The little fellows were so weak and puny that they could not fight at all, and were constantly in terror from the wild geese and other birds that used to come in great flocks from the south to make war upon them. Just at the time the travelers got there, they found the little men in great fear, because there was a strong wind blowing from the south, and it blew white feathers and down along the sand, so the Sundewee knew that their enemies were coming not far behind. The Cherokee asked them why they did not defend themselves, but they said they couldn't because they didn't know how. There was no time to make bows and arrows, but the travelers told them to take sticks for clubs and showed them where to strike the birds on the necks to kill them. The wind blew for several days, and at last the birds came, so many that they were like a great cloud in the air and alighted on the sands. The little men ran to their nests, and the birds followed them and stuck their long bills in to pull them out and eat them. This time, though, the Sundewee had their clubs, and they struck the birds on the neck as the Cherokee had showed them, and killed so many that at last the others were glad to spread their wings and fly away again to the south. The little men thanked the Cherokee for their help, and gave them the best they had until the travelers went on to see the other tribes. They heard afterwards that the birds had came again several times, but the Sundewee always drove them off with their clubs until a flock of sandhill cranes came. They were so tall that the little men could not reach up and strike them on the neck, so at last the cranes killed them all. This Cherokee story of little people fighting geese and cranes is strikingly similar to stories from the Old World. Pliny the Elder wrote the following in his work, Natural History. Beyond these, in the most outlying mountain regions, we are told of the three-span pygmy who do not exceed 3 spans, that is, 27 inches in height. The climate is healthy and always spring-like, and it is always protected on the north by a range of mountains. This tribe Homer has also recorded as being beset by cranes. It's reported that in springtime, their entire band, mounted on the backs of rams and she-goats and armed with arrows, goes in a body down to the sea and eats the crane's eggs and chicks, but otherwise they could not protect themselves against the flocks of cranes that would go up, and that their houses are made of mud and feathers and eggshells. Aristotle says that the pygmies live in caves, but in the rest of this statement about them he agrees with the other authorities. According to the Iliad, a group of pygmies were in constant war with cranes. These cranes migrated in winter to the southern shore of the river Oceanus. Now when the men on both sides were set in order by their leaders, the Trojans came on with clamoring and shouting, like wildfowl, as when the clamor of cranes goes high into the heavens, when the cranes escape the wintertime and the rains unceasing and clamorously wing of their way to the streaming ocean, bringing to the Pygmalion man bloodshed and destruction. At daybreak they bring on the baleful battle against them. Aristotle's work History of Animals seems to corroborate the story in the Iliad. These birds migrate from the steppes of Scythia to the marshlands south of Egypt where the Nile has its source. And it is here, by the way, that they are said to fight with the pygmies. And the story is not fabulous, but there is in reality a race of dwarfish men, and the horses are little in proportion, and the men live in caves underground. It's interesting to note that Aristotle said the pygmies lived beneath the earth in caves. The deeper one digs into the stories of Cherokee little people, the stories mention little people who reside underground in caves and on rocky ledges. So, What does it all mean? What should we make of these stories? I have no idea other than to say the history of the Great Smoky Mountains, America, and beyond is filled with mystery and wonder and is much different than we've been taught to believe.